In a Foreign Town, in a Foreign Land by Thomas Ligotti. Part 4. When you hear the singing, you will know it is time. I had lived in the town near the northern border long enough so that, with the occult passing of time, I had begun to assume that I would never leave there, at least not while I was alive. I would die by my own hand, I might have believed, or possibly by the more usual means of some violent misadventure or some wasting disease. But certainly I had begun to assume that my life's end, as if by right, would take place either within the town itself or in close proximity to its outskirts, where the dense streets and structures of the town started to thin out and eventually dissolved into a desolate and seemingly endless countryside. Following my death, I thought, or had begun unwittingly to assume, I would be buried in the hilltop graveyard outside the town. I had no idea that there were others who might have told me that it was just as likely I would not die in the town, and therefore would not be buried, or interred in any way whatsoever, within the hilltop graveyard. Such persons might have been regarded as hysterics of some kind, or possibly some type of impostor, since everyone who was a permanent resident of the northern border town seemed to be either one or the other, and often both of them at once. These individuals might have suggested to me that it was also entirely possible neither to die in the town nor ever to leave it. I began to learn how such a thing might happen during the time I was living in a small backstairs apartment on the ground floor of a large rooming house located in one of the oldest parts of town. It was in the middle of the night, and I had just awakened in my bed. More precisely, I had started into wakefulness, much as I had done throughout my life. This habit of starting into wakefulness in the middle of the night enabled me to become aware, on that particular night, of a soft droning sound which filled my small one-room apartment, and which I might not have heard had I been the sort of person who remains asleep all night long. The sound was emanating from under the floorboards, and rose up to reverberate in the moonlit darkness of the entire room. After a few moments sitting up in my bed, and then getting out of bed to step quietly around my small apartment, it seemed to me that the soft droning sound I heard was made by a voice, a very deep voice, which spoke as if it were delivering a lecture of some kind, or addressing an audience with the self-assured inflections of authority. Yet I could not discern a single word of what the voice was saying, only its droning intonations, and its deeply reverberant quality as it rose up from beneath the floorboards of my small backstairs apartment. Until that night, I had not suspected that there was a cellar below the rooming house where I lived on the ground floor. I was even less prepared to discover, as I eventually did, that hidden under a small, worn-down carpet, which was the only floor covering in my room, was a trapdoor. An access, it seemed, to whatever basement or cellar might have existed, beyond all my suspicions, below the large rooming house. But there was something else unusual about this trapdoor, aside from its very presence in my small apartment room, and the fact that it implied the existence of some type of rooming house cellar. Although the trapdoor was somehow set into the floorboards of my room, it did not in any way appear to be of a piece with them. The trapdoor, as I thought of it, did not at all seem to be constructed of wood, but of something that was more of a leathery consistency, all withered and warped and cracked in places, as though it did not fit in with the roughly parallel lines of the floorboards in my room, but clearly opposed them both in its shape and its angles, which were highly irregular by any standards that might conceivably apply to a rooming house trapdoor. I could not even say if this leathery trap door had 4 sides to it, or possibly 5 sides or more, so elusive and misshapen was its crude and shriveled construction, at least as I saw it, in the moonlight, after starting into wakefulness in my small backstairs apartment. Yet I was absolutely certain that the deeply reverberant voice which continued to drone on and on as I inspected the trap door was in fact emanating from a place, a cellar or basement of some kind, directly below my room. I knew this to be true because I placed my hand, very briefly, on the trapdoor's leathery and irregular surface, and in that moment I could feel that it was pulsing, in a way that corresponded to the force and rhythms of the voice which echoed its indecipherable words throughout the rest of that night, fading only moments before daylight. Having remained awake for most of the night, I left my backstairs apartment and began to wander the streets of the northern border town on a cold and overcast morning in late autumn. Throughout the whole of that day, I saw the town, where I had already lived for some time, under an aspect I had not known before. I have stated that this town near the northern border was a place where I had assumed I would one day die, and I may even say it was a place where I actually desired to make an end of it, or such was the intention or wish that I entertained at certain times, and in certain places, including my residence in one of the oldest sections of the town. But as I wandered the streets on that overcast morning in late autumn and throughout the day, my entire sense of my surroundings, as well as my intuition that my existence would be terminated within those surroundings, had become altered in a completely unexpected manner. The town had, of course, always displayed certain peculiar and often profoundly surprising qualities and features. Sooner or later, everyone who was a permanent resident there was confronted with something of a nearly insupportable oddity or corruption. As I wandered along one byway or another throughout that morning and into late afternoon, I recalled a specific street near the edge of town, a dead-end street, where all the houses and other buildings seemed to have grown into one another, melding their diverse materials into a bizarre and jagged conglomerate of massive architectural proportions, with peaked roofs and soaring chimneys or towers visibly swaying and audibly moaning even in the calm of an early summer twilight. I had thought that this was the absolute limit, only to find out at exactly the moment of having this thought that there was something further involved with this street, something that caused persons living in the area to repeat a special slogan or incantation to whomever would listen. "When you hear the singing," they said, "you will know it is time." These words were spoken, and I heard them myself, as if the persons muttering them were attempting to absolve or protect themselves in some way that was beyond any further explication. And whether or not one heard the singing, or had ever heard what was called the singing, and whether or not that obscure and unspeakable time ever came, or would ever come to those who arrived in that street with its houses and other buildings all mingled together and tumbling into the sky, there nevertheless remained within you the feeling that this was still the place, the town near the northern border, where you came to live and where you might believe you would be a permanent resident, until either you chose to leave it or until you died, possibly by violent misadventure or some wasting disease, if not by your own hand. Yet, on that overcast morning in late autumn, I could no longer maintain this feeling, not after having heard that droning voice which delivered some incomprehensible sermon for hours on end, and not after having seen that leathery trapdoor which I placed my hand upon for only a brief moment, and thereafter retreated to the furthest corner of my small apartment until daylight. And I was not the only one to notice a change within the town, as I discovered when twilight drew on and more of us began to collect on street corners or in back alleys, as well as in abandoned storefront rooms or old office buildings where most of the furniture was badly broken and out-of-date calendars hung crooked on the walls. It was difficult for some persons to refrain from observing that there seemed to be fewer of us as the shadows of twilight gathered that day. Even Mrs. Glim, whose lodging-house plus brothel was as populous as ever with its out-of-town clientele, said that among the permanent residents of the northern border town there was a noticeably diminished number of persons. A man named Mr. Pell, sometimes Dr. Pell, was, to my knowledge, the first to use the word disappearances in order to illuminate, during the course of one of our twilight gatherings, the cause of the town's slightly reduced population. He was sitting in the shadows on the other side of an overturned desk or bookcase, so his words were not entirely audible as he whispered them in the direction of a darkened doorway, perhaps speaking to someone who was standing, or possibly lying down, in the darkness beyond the aperture. But once this concept of disappearances, that is, had been introduced, it seemed that quite a few persons had something to say on the subject, especially those who had lived in the town longer than most of us, or who had lived in the oldest parts of the town for more years than I had. It was from one of the latter, a veteran of all kinds of hysteria, that I learned about the demonic preacher Reverend Cork, whose sermonizing I had apparently heard during the previous night as it reverberated through the leathery trapdoor in my apartment room.
"You didn't happen to open that trapdoor, did you?"
the old hysteric asked in a somewhat coy tone of voice. We were sitting, just the two of us, on some wooden crates we had found in the opening to a narrow alley.
"Tell me,"
he urged, as the light from a street lamp shone upon his thin face in the darkening twilight.
"Tell me that you didn't just take a little peek inside that trapdoor."
I then told him I had done nothing of the sort. Suddenly, he began to laugh hysterically in a voice that was both high-pitched and extremely coarse.
"Of course, you didn't take a little peek inside the trapdoor," he said when he finally settled down. "If you had, then you wouldn't be here with me. You'd be there with him."
The antics and coy tone of the old hysteric notwithstanding, there was a meaning in his words that resonated with my experience in my apartment room and also with my perception that day of a profound change in the town near the northern border. At first, I tended to conceive of the figure of Reverend Cork as a spirit of the dead, someone who had disappeared by wholly natural means. In these terms, I was able to think of myself as having been the victim of a haunting at the large rooming house, where no doubt many persons had ended their lives in one way or another. This metaphysical framework seemed to apply nicely to my recent experiences, and did not conflict with what I had been told in that narrow alley as twilight turned into evening. I was indeed here, in the northern border town with the old hysteric, and not there, in the land of the dead with Reverend Cork, the demonic preacher. But, as the night wore on, and I moved among other residents of the town who had lived there far longer than I, it became evident that Reverend Cork, whose voice I had heard preaching the night before, was neither dead, in the usual sense of the word, nor among those who had only recently disappeared, many of whom, I learned, had not disappeared in any mysterious way at all, but had simply abandoned the northern border town without notifying anyone. They had made this hasty exodus, according to several hysterics or impostors I spoke with that night, because they had seen the signs, even as I had seen that leathery trapdoor, whose existence in my apartment room was previously and entirely unsuspected. Although I had not recognized it as such, this trapdoor, which appeared to lead to a cellar beneath the rooming house where I lived, was among the most typical of the so-called signs. All of them, as numerous persons hysterically avowed, were indications of some type of threshold, doorways or passages that one should be cautious not to enter or even to approach. Most of these signs, in fact, took the form of doors of various types, particularly those which might be found in odd, out-of-the-way places, such as a miniature door at the back of a broom closet, or a door appearing on the inner wall of a fireplace, or even doors that might not seem to lead to any sensible space, as would be the case with a trapdoor in an apartment on the ground floor of a rooming house that did not have a cellar, nor had ever had one that could be accessed in such a way. I did hear about other such threshold signs, including window frames in the most queer locations, stairways that spiraled downward into depths beneath the common basement or led below ground level along lonely sidewalks, and even entrances to streets that were not formerly known to exist, with perhaps a narrow gate swinging open in temptation. Yet all of these signs or thresholds gave themselves away by their distinctive appearance, which, according to many of those knowledgeable of such things, was very much like that withered and leathery appearance of the trapdoor in my apartment room, not to mention displaying the same kind of shapes and angles that were strikingly at odds with their surroundings. Nevertheless, there were still those who, for one reason or another, chose to ignore the signs, or were unable to resist the enticements of thresholds that simply cropped up overnight in the most unforeseen places around the northern border town. To all appearances, at that point, the demonic preacher Reverend Cork had been one of the persons who had disappeared in this way. I now became aware, as the evening progressed into a brilliantly star-filled night, that I had not been the victim of a haunting, as I had earlier supposed, but had actually witnessed a phenomenon of quite a different sort. "The Reverend has been gone since the last disappearances," said an old woman, whose face I could barely see in the candlelight that illuminated the enormous, echoing lobby of a defunct hotel where some of us had gathered after midnight. But someone took issue with the old woman, or idiot hag, as this person called her. The preacher, this other person, contended in exactly the following words, was "Old Town." This was my first exposure to the phrase "Old Town," but before I could take in its full meaning or implications, it began to undergo a metamorphosis among those gathered after midnight in the lobby of that defunct hotel. Well, the person who called the old woman an idiot hag continued to speak of the old town where he said Reverend Cook resided or was originally from. The old woman and a few of those who sided with her spoke only about the other town. "No one is from the other town," the woman said to the person who was calling her an idiot hag. "There are only those who disappeared into the other town, among them the demonic preacher Reverend Cork, who may have been a ludicrous impostor, but was never what anyone would call demonic, until he disappeared into that trapdoor in the room where this gentleman," she said, referring to me, "heard him preaching only last night." "You idiot hag," said the other person, "that old town existed on the very spot where this northern border town now exists, until the day when it disappeared along with everyone who lived in it, including the demonic preacher, Reverend Cork." Then someone else, who was lying deep in the cushions of an old divan in the lobby, added the following words: "It was a demon town, and was inhabited by demonic entities of all sorts who made the whole thing invisible. Now they threw out these thresholds as a way to lure another group of us who only want to live in this town near the northern border and not in some intolerable demon town." Nonetheless, the old woman and the few others who sided with her persisted in speaking not about an old town or an invisible demon town, but about the other town, which they all agreed never had any concrete existence to speak of, but was simply a metaphysical backdrop to the northern border town that we all knew, and that was a place where many of us fervently desired to make an end of our lives. Whatever the facts in this matter, one point was hammered into my brain over and over again. There was simply no peace to be had, no matter where you hid yourself away. Even in a northern border town of such intensely chaotic oddity and corruption, there was still some greater chaos, some deeper insanity than one had counted on, or could ever be taken into account. Wherever there was anything, there would be chaos and insanity to such a degree that one could never come to terms with it, and it was only a matter of time before your world, whatever you thought it to be, was undermined, if not completely overrun, by another world. Throughout the late hours of that night, the debates and theories and fine qualifications continued regarding the spectral towns and the tangible thresholds that served to reduce the number of permanent residents of the northern border town, either by causing them to disappear through some out-of-the-way door or window, or down a spiraling stairway or phantom street, or by forcing them to abandon the town because, for whatever reason, it had become, or seemed to become, something quite different from the place they had known it to be, or believed it to be, for so long. Whether or not they arrived at a resolution of their conflicting views, I will never know, since I left the defunct hotel while the discussion was still going strong. But I did not go back to my small apartment in one of the oldest parts of town. Instead, I wandered out to the hilltop graveyard outside of town and stood among the graves until the following morning, which was as cold and overcast as the one before it. I knew then that I would not die in the northern border town, either by means of a violent misadventure or a wasting disease or even by my own hand, and therefore I would not be buried in the hilltop graveyard where I stood that morning looking down on the place where I had lived for so long. I had already wandered the streets of the northern border town for the last time and found, for whatever reason, that they had become something different from what they had been, or had once seemed to be. This was the only thing that was now certain in my mind. For a moment, I considered returning to the town and seeking out one of the newly appeared thresholds in order to enter it before all of them mysteriously disappeared again, so that I might disappear along with them into the other town, or the old town, where perhaps I might find once more what I seemed to have lost in the northern border town. Possibly there might have been something there, on the other side of the town, that was like the dead-end street, where it was said, "When you hear the singing, you will know it is time." And while I might never be able to die in the town near the northern border, neither would I ever have to leave it. To have such thoughts was, of course, only mere chaos and insanity, but I had not slept for 2 nights. I was tired and felt the ache of every broken dream I had ever carried with me. Perhaps I would one day seek out another town in another land where I could make an end of it, or at least where I could wait in a fatalistic delirium for the end to come. Now it was time to just walk away in silence. Years later, I learned there was a movement to clean up the northern border town of what was elsewhere perceived to be its contaminated elements. On arriving in the town, however, the investigators assigned to this task discovered a place that was all but deserted, the only remaining residents being a few hysterics or impostors who muttered endlessly about other towns or demon towns or even of an old town. Among these individuals was a large and gaudily attired old woman who styled herself as the owner of a lodging house and several other properties. These venues, she said, along with many others throughout the town, had been rendered uninhabitable and useless for any practical purpose. This statement seemed to capsulize the findings of the investigators, who ultimately composed a report that was dismissive of any threat that might be posed by the town near the northern border, which, whatever else it may have been or seemed to be, was always a genius of the most insidious illusion.